A pregnant woman was abandoned on the western road until a poor farmer changed her story. The dust swirled around her collapsed farm like vultures circling carrion, her swollen belly rising and falling with each labored breath as the merciless sun carved shadows into the cracked earth. Blood stained the torn fabric of her dress where thorns had clawed at her flesh during her desperate crawl from the overturned wagon that lay splintered 50 yards behind her, its broken wheels spinning lazily in the desert wind. Her fingers dug into the scorching sand as another contraction seized her body like iron fists, the pain so fierce it stole her voice and left only the whistle of wind through sagebrush to answer her silent screams. Flies buzzed around the gash on her forehead where she had struck the wagon's edge, and her lips had cracked into bleeding lines that spoke of days without water. The baby inside her kicked frantically. But here's what haunts me most about her story. When you see a woman dying alone in the wilderness, carrying life in her womb, do you stop to help, even if it means risking everything you've worked for? Or do you convince yourself that someone else will come along, someone braver, someone with more to give? Because in that moment, when mercy demands everything and offers nothing in return, what would you choose? Your comfort or her survival? The buzzards had already begun their patient descent, their wings casting fleeting shadows across her face as they settled on the broken wagon's remains. And in that frozen moment of agony, one decision would either damn her to become another forgotten grave along the frontier, or transform both their lives in ways neither could imagine. 3 days earlier,
the morning had dawned clear and peaceful over the small homestead where Samuel Morrison pulled water from his well with the same steady rhythm he'd maintained for 7 years. The wooden bucket creaked against the rope as it descended into the darkness below, returning with water so cold it made his teeth ache when he drank. His calloused hands, permanently stained with soil and sun, moved with the efficiency of a man who had learned to survive alone in country that killed the careless and buried the weak. The corn stalks in his meager field stood barely knee-high, their leaves already yellowing at the edges from the relentless drought that had turned most neighboring farms into monuments of failure. Samuel's weathered face, carved by wind and worry into premature lines, showed no expression as he surveyed his struggling crop. He had planted with the last of his savings, betting everything on rainfall that never came and faith that grew thinner with each cloudless dawn. Inside the one-room cabin that served as kitchen, bedroom, and refuge, the silence pressed against him like a physical weight. The empty chair beside his rough-hewn table still held the ghost of his wife Mary, who had died giving birth to their stillborn son 2 winters past. Her sewing basket sat untouched on the windowsill, gathering dust like a shrine to dreams that had crumbled to ash in his hands. If stories of resilience and unexpected kindness speak to you, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next chapter of courage that unfolds in the most unlikely places. Samuel poured the well water into a cracked basin and splashed his face, the shock of cold clearing his mind for another day of fighting the land for survival. He had learned to measure time not in hours, but in small victories. A successful repair, a meal that filled his belly, a night without dreams of Mary's voice calling his name from empty rooms. The loneliness had carved a hollow space in his chest that echoed with every heartbeat, but he had made peace with solitude the way other men made peace with death. He stepped outside to begin his morning ritual of checking fences when the sound reached him, faint as a whisper but unmistakably human. A cry of pain carried on the wind from the direction of the main road, so distant he might have imagined it, if not for the way it made his spine stiffen with recognition.
Someone was suffering out there in the wasteland, and every instinct born of frontier living screamed at him to ignore it, to protect what little he had built from the chaos that followed human desperation like a plague. But Samuel Morrison had been raised by a mother who believed mercy was not a luxury, but a necessity. And despite 2 years of bitter solitude, that teaching still lived in his bones like marrow. He grabbed his canteen, his rifle, and a blanket, then saddled his old mare with hands that trembled not from fear, but from the memory of loss. Because every act of kindness on the frontier carried the price of vulnerability, and vulnerability had already cost him everything that mattered. The ride to the main road took 20 minutes through scrubland that stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the skeletal remains of other failed dreams. Abandoned homesteads with doors hanging open like mouths frozen in silent screams. Samuel's mare picked her way carefully between rocks and rabbit holes while he scanned the horizon for movement, knowing that isolated cries often meant trouble for anyone foolish enough to investigate. Then he saw her. The woman lay crumpled beside the wreckage of a covered wagon, her body contorted in a way that spoke of profound agony. Her dress, once blue as summer sky, now hung in tatters that revealed bruises and cuts, painting her pale skin in shades of violence. But it was her swollen belly that stopped Samuel's heart. She was heavy with child, maybe 8 months along, and each breath she drew seemed to cost her more strength than she possessed. Samuel dismounted and approached slowly, his rifle loose in his hands but ready. She might be bait for desperate men hiding in the brush, or she might be exactly what she appeared, a woman abandoned to die in the most brutal way imaginable. Her eyes fluttered open as he knelt beside her, revealing irises the color of winter grass, dulled by pain but still holding fragments of defiant life. "Please," she whispered, the word barely more than breath. But his act of mercy would soon attract attention far more dangerous than he could imagine. The woman's name was Catherine, and her story emerged in fragments between contractions that doubled her over with agony. Her husband had been a traveling preacher named Thomas, who promised her a new life in California. But 3 days into their journey, when the labor pains began and blood started staining her dress, his faith in Providence had crumbled faster than his courage. He had unhitched the horses in the middle of the night, taken their supplies and water, leaving her with nothing but a broken wagon and the kind of abandonment that scarred deeper than any physical wound. Samuel carried her to his homestead in arms that shook from the weight of responsibility he had sworn never to accept again. Her body burned with fever, while the baby inside fought to enter a world that had already proven its cruelty. And every mile of that journey home felt like a prayer sent to a God who had stopped listening long ago. By the time he laid her on his bed, Mary's bed, Catherine had lost consciousness, leaving Samuel alone with decisions that could save or damn them both. He had no medical training beyond the basic frontier knowledge of setting bones and cleaning wounds, but birth was something different. Something that required skills he had never learned and confidence he did not possess. Mary had died in this same bed while he held her hand and watched helplessly as life slipped away like water through his fingers. And now fate had delivered another woman to the same fate with mocking precision. But Samuel Morrison had learned something about himself in the long nights since Mary's death, that the fear of losing someone was no excuse for refusing to try. He boiled water, found clean linens, and prepared to deliver a baby with hands that remembered holding death but had never delivered life. Outside, the wind howled like an omen, while inside, Catherine's moans filled the cabin with sounds that made his soul ache with recognition. The first visitor arrived at dawn, when Catherine's labor had lasted 18 hours and left both her and Samuel exhausted beyond measure. Sheriff Martinez rode up with dust trailing behind his horse like a brown shadow.
"Heard you might have a runaway wife up here, Morrison," Martinez called through the door, his voice carrying the authority of 10 years keeping peace in lawless country. "Thomas Whitmore filed a complaint in town yesterday. Says his pregnant wife stole his wagon and horses, left him stranded on the road. He's pressing charges for theft and desertion." Samuel opened the door just wide enough to show his face, positioning his body to block any view of the woman writhing in pain on his bed. The sheriff's eyes were hard as flint, weathered by dealing with lies and desperate people. But there was something in his expression that suggested he had already heard both versions of this story and found them both lacking in truth. "No runaway wife here," Samuel replied, his voice steady despite the chaos behind him. "Just helping a woman in labor who was abandoned to die on the road. If you found a woman dying in childbirth and her husband claimed she was a thief who deserved her fate, would you believe his word or trust what your eyes had seen?" Martinez studied Samuel's face with the intensity of a man reading signs for danger, then glanced past him toward the sounds of suffering that leaked through the cabin walls like smoke. "Thomas says she's carrying stolen goods along with his child. Says she's got his dead mother's jewelry and $200 in gold coins that belong to the church collection." The accusation hit Samuel like a physical blow because he had not thought to search Catherine's belongings, had not considered that her desperation might be rooted in guilt rather than innocence. But as another cry of pain emerged from the cabin, followed by the sound of Catherine calling his name in delirium, Samuel made the choice that would define not just his character, but his fate. "Sheriff, whatever crime she may or may not have committed, she's fighting for 2 lives right now," Samuel said, stepping fully into the doorway so Martinez could see the determination in his eyes. "When this baby is born and she can speak for herself, then we'll settle questions of theft and justice. But until then, she stays under my protection." Martinez nodded slowly, a gesture that carried more respect than Samuel had expected. "Fair enough, Morrison, but Thomas is riding back here with a federal marshal and a warrant. They'll be here by sunset, and if she can't prove her innocence, they'll take her back to face charges regardless of her condition." The sheriff rode away, leaving Samuel with knowledge that transformed rescue into rebellion, because protecting Catherine now meant defying not just her husband, but the law itself. And as her cries grew more desperate and the sun climbed higher toward its inevitable rendezvous with judgment, Samuel realized that some acts of mercy demanded everything, including the willingness to become an outlaw for the sake of someone else's redemption. The baby came with the setting sun, emerging into the world with lungs that announced her arrival like a trumpet call to heaven. Catherine's final push tore a scream from her throat that seemed to shake the cabin walls. And then suddenly there was silence, broken only by the thin, fierce cry of new life demanding attention from a world that had tried to kill her before she drew her first breath. Samuel held the tiny girl with hands that trembled from exhaustion and wonder. Her skin still slick with birth, but her eyes already open and staring at him with the ancient wisdom that newborns carry like secrets from another realm. She was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, lungs that worked like bellows, and a grip that fastened onto his thumb with surprising strength when he touched her palm. Catherine lay back against the pillow, soaked with sweat and tears, her body spent, but her eyes blazing with the fierce joy that transforms pain into triumph.
"My daughter," she whispered, reaching for the child with arms that shook from weakness but moved with the sure instinct of motherhood. Sarah. Her name is Sarah. But even as mother and daughter found each other in that sacred moment of first touch, the sound of approaching horses drummed against the evening air like thunder before a storm. Samuel moved to the window and counted 6 riders approaching in formation, too many for a simple arrest, too organized for anything but serious trouble. The lead rider wore a federal marshal's badge that caught the last light of day, while the others carried rifles with the casual readiness of men accustomed to violence. "Catherine," Samuel said, his voice urgent but gentle, "they're here. Whatever happened between you and Thomas, whatever he's accusing you of, you need to tell me the truth now." She closed her eyes and drew Sarah closer to her chest, where the baby's cries softened into contented murmurs. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of confession and the bitter taste of betrayal finally given voice. "Thomas never intended to take me to California," she said. "He married me for my inheritance, money my father left me from selling our farm back east. $3,000 in gold that he thought would be easy to steal once we were alone on the road. But when the labor started early and I became a burden instead of a prize, he decided I was worth more dead than alive." The riders had stopped outside the cabin, their horses snorting and stamping in the gathering darkness. Samuel could hear low voices conferring, the clink of weapons being checked, the creak of leather as men prepared for confrontation. Through the window, he saw Thomas Whitmore dismounting from his horse. "He took the money anyway," Catherine continued, her voice growing stronger with anger. "Said I died in childbirth, and he barely escaped with his life. But he made one mistake. He didn't check my saddlebags carefully enough. I still have the deed to my father's land and a letter he wrote explaining how Thomas threatened to kill me if I didn't sign over my inheritance." Samuel felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition that this moment would define not just their immediate fate, but the kind of man he chose to be in the face of impossible odds. Outside, Marshal Henderson's voice cut through the evening air with the authority of federal law and the promise of justice that rarely favored the poor or the powerless. "Samuel Morrison, we have a warrant for the arrest of Catherine Whitmore on charges of theft, desertion, and adultery. Send her out now, and there won't be any trouble." But Sarah chose that moment to cry again, her voice carrying through the cabin walls like a declaration of innocence that no court could ignore. And in that sound, Samuel heard not just the protest of new life, but the echo of every child who had ever needed protection from the cruelty of adults who had forgotten what mercy meant. If 6 armed men demanded you surrender a woman who had just given birth, would you open the door and trust their version of justice? Or would you make them prove their righteousness with something more than badges and guns? Samuel opened the door, but did not step aside, his body filling the frame like a barrier between 2 worlds, the one where might made right, and the one where protecting the innocent mattered more than self-preservation. Marshal Henderson was a tall man with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much of humanity's worst impulses. But there was something in his expression that suggested he took no pleasure in hunting down women who had just given birth. "She's not going anywhere until she's strong enough to travel," Samuel said, his voice carrying across the distance between them like a challenge thrown down in dust. "And when she does leave, it'll be with proof of her innocence and her baby in her arms." Thomas stepped forward, his preacher's face arranged in an expression of righteous indignation that might have convinced men who had not spent their lives learning to read the difference between performance and truth. "Marshal, this woman stole $3,000 from our church collection and abandoned her Christian duties as a wife. The law is clear about such matters. The law is also clear about attempting to murder your pregnant wife, Samuel replied, never taking his eyes off Henderson's face. Catherine has documentation that tells a different story than the one you've been spreading. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the two groups faced each other across 20 yards of desert that had witnessed countless similar confrontations. The marshal's hand rested on his gun but had not drawn it, while his deputies waited for orders that could end in bloodshed or something approaching justice. Thomas's face had begun to show cracks in its pious mask, revealing glimpses of the desperation that drove men to abandon pregnant women in wastelands. Then Catherine's voice came from inside the cabin, weak but clear enough to carry to every man present. "Marshal Henderson, I have papers that prove every word Samuel has spoken. My husband tried to steal my inheritance and leave me to die when I became inconvenient. But I also have something else, witnesses who saw him in the saloon 3 towns back, bragging about how he would be rich once his wife died in childbirth." The marshal's eyebrows rose slightly, the first sign of interest in something beyond a simple arrest.
"What kind of witnesses, ma'am?" "The kind with badges of their own," Catherine replied. "Sheriff Martinez has already taken statements from 2 deputies who heard Thomas's confession. They're riding here now with documentation that will interest a federal court." Samuel saw the exact moment when Thomas realized his carefully constructed lie was crumbling faster than he could rebuild it. The preacher's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, fear, and finally the cold calculation of a man with nothing left to lose. His hand moved toward the gun tucked beneath his coat with the speed of someone who had clearly considered this possibility. But Marshal Henderson was faster, his weapon clear in leather and aiming at Thomas's chest before the false preacher could complete his draw. "I wouldn't if I were you," Henderson said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had ended similar situations without breaking a sweat. "Attempted murder is a hanging offense, but drawing on a federal marshal is a guaranteed death sentence." The confrontation ended not with gunfire, but with the sound of metal clicking against metal as handcuffs closed around Thomas's wrists. The other riders remained mounted but relaxed, recognizing the shift in circumstances that transformed them from a posse into witnesses to justice served with unexpected efficiency. Marshal Henderson approached the cabin door with his hat in his hand, the gesture of a man who understood that some situations required respect rather than authority. "Ma'am, I'd like to see those documents when you're feeling up to it, and I owe you an apology. Sometimes the law gets pointed in the wrong direction before truth has a chance to catch up." Inside the cabin, Catherine sat up in bed with Sarah nursing contentedly at her breast, both of them surrounded by the golden light of oil lamps that made the rough room seem almost sacred. She handed Samuel a leather portfolio that contained not just the papers she had mentioned, but photographs, letters, and legal documents that told the story of a systematic campaign to steal her inheritance through fraud and attempted murder. "How did you know Sheriff Martinez was coming?" Samuel asked, wonder and relief battling for space in his voice. Catherine smiled for the first time since he had found her, the expression transforming her exhausted face into something approaching beauty. "I didn't, but sometimes when you've lost everything except the truth, you have to bet your life that someone will believe it when you speak it aloud." The resolution came with surprising swiftness once the truth emerged from behind Thomas's carefully constructed lies. The federal marshal's investigation revealed a pattern of fraud stretching across 3 states. Raspy being only the most recent victim in a series of schemes that had targeted widows and orphaned women with property or money. Thomas faced charges that would keep him in federal prison for the rest of his natural life, while Catherine found herself not just free, but wealthy enough to start over anywhere she chose. But freedom, Samuel learned, sometimes carried its own complicated weight. "I want to buy your farm," Catherine said on the morning she was strong enough to sit outside in the sunshine while Sarah slept in her arms. "Not take it from you, buy it fair and square, then deed half of it back to you as payment for saving our lives." Samuel sat beside her on the porch he had built with his own hands, watching the sunrise paint his struggling cornfield in shades of gold that made even failure look beautiful. The offer would solve every financial problem that haunted his days and nights, would give him security he had not known since Mary's death, would transform his hard-scrabble existence into something approaching prosperity. But prosperity built on someone else's gratitude felt like charity dressed up in legal language, and Samuel Morrison had too much pride to accept what he had not earned through his own sweat and sacrifice. "Keep your money," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Buy land of your own, somewhere Sarah can grow up safe. What I did for you wasn't business. It was just being human when humanity was required." Catherine studied his profile with eyes that had learned to recognize character in the way other people recognized weather patterns. "Then let me make you a different offer," she said. "Partner with me. Use your knowledge of farming and my money to build something neither of us could create alone. Not charity, not payment, partnership based on what we can contribute to each other's success." The idea settled into Samuel's mind like seeds finding fertile ground. Partnership meant shared risk and shared reward, meant building something larger than either of them could achieve alone, meant the possibility of community in a place where solitude had been his only companion for too long. More importantly, it meant Sarah would grow up with a father figure who understood both the harshness of frontier life and the necessity of kindness when harshness alone was not enough. "Equal partners?" Samuel asked, extending his hand toward Catherine with the formal gesture of men sealing agreements that would bind their futures together. "Equal partners," she agreed, taking his hand in hers while Sarah made small sleeping sounds between them. "In farming, in raising this little girl, and in proving that sometimes mercy is the most practical investment a person can make." The handshake lasted longer than business required. Very fast-paced, clear and steady, feels like a cowboy telling a continuous tale and not reading. Acknowledging not just a financial arrangement, but the recognition of two people who had found in each other's company a refuge from loneliness that had become too heavy to carry alone. 6 months later, as Samuel watched Sarah take her first steps across the porch of their expanded cabin, he understood that some rescues worked both ways. He had saved Catherine and her daughter from death on a dusty road, but they had saved him from something potentially worse, a life so defined by past loss that it could not recognize present possibility. The corn grew tall that season, nourished by the well they had dug together and the irrigation system Catherine's money had made possible. Their small ranch became known throughout the territory, not just for its prosperity, but for the kind of hospitality that offered shelter to travelers and second chances to people who had made mistakes but were willing to make amends. And on quiet evenings when Sarah fell asleep between them and the desert stars painted stories across the infinite sky, Samuel would remember the moment he chose mercy over safety, kindness over self-preservation, and how that single decision had transformed not just their individual fates, but the very definition of family itself. Because sometimes the greatest treasures are not gold or land or security, but the knowledge that when faced with another person's desperate need, you chose to be the kind of human being your mother raised you to be, regardless of the cost, regardless of the risk, regardless of everything, except the simple truth that some things are worth whatever price they demand. Years passed, and their story became legend in the territory, not because it was unique, but because it reminded people of what was possible when strangers chose to see each other as human beings worthy of rescue, rather than problems to be avoided.
Samuel and Catherine built more than a successful ranch. They built a legacy of compassion that inspired others to look beyond their own immediate needs when faced with someone else's crisis. And Sarah grew up knowing that her life began not with abandonment, but with rescue, not with cruelty, but with the kind of love that demanded nothing in return, except the promise to pass such kindness forward when her own moment of choice inevitably arrived. Would you have stopped for a pregnant woman bleeding by the roadside, knowing that mercy might cost you everything you had worked to build? Or would you have convinced yourself that someone else would come along, someone with more to give and less to lose? Because that choice between comfort and compassion, between safety and service to something larger than ourselves, defines not just our individual character, but the very soul of civilization itself.
Subscribe for more stories that remind us what it means to be human when humanity is tested by circumstances that strip away everything except our willingness to choose love over fear. Click on the next video to discover how a blind man's trust in a stranger's voice led to a confrontation that changed an entire town's understanding of what courage really looks like.